help DOE through technical assistance, and also house the results of the webinars, the recordings on our environmental database, TETHIS. The webinar has three major goals. The webinar series has three major goals. The first one is to identify gaps and priority areas for future research efforts. The second is to communicate ongoing studies and results. And the third is to help inform siting and permitting efforts. Next slide, please, Anna. As I mentioned, this is the fourth webinar. We've had three previously. The first was on data management, risk assessment, and cumulative effects. The second was on aquatic animals and device interactions. And the third was on monitoring technologies and strategies. And all those webinars can be viewed at the link below. I believe that link is also on the webinar flyer, so you can access the past webinars and this one when it is available soon. Next slide, please, Anna. So this particular webinar, as I mentioned, is on potential acoustic impacts. And of course, acoustic impacts are a topic of research that is of interest to regulators in both abroad as well as the U.S. And there are still plenty of questions out there, from the most basic questions about how to measure acoustic outputs of devices to more complicated questions about how acoustic outputs could potentially affect individuals and populations of marine animals of concern. So our speakers today are really spanning that range. We have two speakers that are coming to us from Europe and offer the European experience, as well as three speakers who will discuss research underway here in the U.S. You can see the list of speakers there. I'll introduce each one as they come up. But very quickly, Gareth Davies from Aquaterra, John Harwood from the University of St. Andrews, Brian Pelagi from the University of Washington, Michelle Halverson from Pacific Northwest National Lab, and Chris Bassett from University of Washington. And last slide, please, Anna. So very important. We're going pretty quickly through these presentations. Each speaker will have about 20 minutes, and we're going to save 5 minutes at the end of each talk for audience Q&A. And the way we're going to do this is you should see on your webinar control bar a little dialog box that says questions. Rather than raising your hand and having you ask your question in audio mode, we're going to ask you to type your question into the chat box. Just type it in and press send. Questions will come to Jocelyn, Anna, and myself, and we will compile those, and I'll ask them of the presenter following the presentation out loud so we can all hear it. If your question doesn't get answered out loud, we will be sending questions to speakers for them to answer in written form, which you will all be able to see. So with that, I think we will kick off our first presentation. So our first presenter will be Gareth Davies from Aquaterra, and he'll be presenting his research on noise feedback from 8 years of ocean energy experience in Scotland. And Gareth, it's about 10:10 now. I'll give you a 5-minute warning at 10:25, and then we'll have Q&A after that.
So yeah, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be speaking to you from Scotland, and what I wanted to do was just reflect on some of the thoughts we've had about noise and underwater noise relating to marine renewables. And I guess you can see from the title that we're kind of sitting in this paradox between thinking that some of these machines are not particularly noisy, and yet a lot of people are concentrating on noise as a key impact from them. And I want to touch on some of those issues. So in the presentation, I want to talk about the architecture of underwater noise issues, the parts of the chain of events that lead to impacts from noise, look at existing noise conditions in the sea, consider ocean energy devices that are coming through and the noise levels that might be associated with them, and also look at that in comparison with different noise sources. And then finally, just to reflect on how ocean energy projects should be best managed. Okay. So in terms of the architecture of underwater noise, first of all, basically there's a progression between existing noise sources in the sea. We're then looking at putting new devices into the water, and these devices are going to add to the background levels of noise, and the noise will arise both from the generation of devices but also from support vessel noise. That combination of noise will then propagate and dissipate through the environment in a particular pattern depending on the physical conditions and the physical state of the noise as well. That noise will then get detected by potentially sensitive receptors, and those receptors will then respond to that noise, and that response will lead then to a consequence for that species or receptor to the noise. And those receptors are also at the same time responding to other variables which lead to the conditions that they have in their environment, and that's the overall sequence of events that we have relating to underwater noise. And what I'm going to do today is concentrate very much on this first part here, because I think this is where we can actually get most useful information at the present time. So if we look at ambient noise levels, natural noise occurs in the ocean through many sources. There's also a number of man-made sources, and this map of frequency against amplitude shows some of the classic noises that exist in the ocean already. So we need to remember that the ocean is a noisy place already. Over the last if we think about the activities that may occur in the sea, thinking first about ocean energy devices, and that's the focus of today's talk, there are perhaps 50 devices around the world that are in relation to wave and tidal energy that are actually in situ at the moment. That compares with other levels of activity such as the number of drilling rigs, which might be around 2,000 in the world, the number of oil and gas production platforms in the marine environment, which might be 8,000, the number of merchant ships, these are large tankers, container vessels, dry cargo vessels, cruise liners, which number about 100,000. And then if we look at the smaller vessels, such as fishing vessels, we believe there's about 1.3 million around the world's oceans. And when we come to recreational boats, perhaps the most numerous source of noise from man-made activities, there's about 12 million boats in the US and perhaps 100 million boats worldwide. So all of these activities are leading to anthropogenic noise in the marine environment at the present time. Now, what I wanted to do was reflect on the power levels that are associated with marine energy devices and compare that to, in this case, boat engine sizes. Looking at the correlation between kilowatts, which are often used to characterize power devices, and horsepower, which are related to boat engines most often, 1 kilowatt is equal to about 1.3 horsepower, and I've therefore taken those as roughly equivalent for the purpose of this comparison. And what we're showing here is the size of engine. This is a 1 horsepower engine, something you could pick up very easily in your hand. We've got a 10 horsepower engine, a 100 horsepower engine, and stepping up. And we're comparing that with wave devices and tidal energy devices, which have 1 kilowatt power outputs at this level. And I think it's interesting to reflect on the sizes of the relative sizes of these machines, and also to remember that these engines are actually putting energy into the water, whereas the output of these machines are actually taking energy out of the water. And we'll come back to that in terms of the importance there for noise. And what we can see is that the what you might call the commercial scale devices, the 1 megawatt, 1,000 kilowatt devices, which people are generally talking about rolling out for commercial wave parks, are equivalent to a small workboat, maybe a medium market pleasure boat. And once you get up into the higher power workboats and then the merchant class vessels, they're equivalent to the small arrays and the larger arrays. The prototype devices that we're looking at deploying really in the next 5 years are probably more equivalent to very small outboards associated with smaller pleasure boats. So I think that comparison of these are activities that are all going on in the sea at the moment, this is what we're proposing, and we're working at this level, which is basically equivalent to these very small engines. So let's just reflect on the noise levels that are associated with 3 different sources. So here I've looked at a merchant vessel, and typically the source levels of noise for merchant vessels range from about 100 decibels up to about 180 decibels. Now those noises arise from propellers, they arise from engine room noise, and to a certain extent from waves slapping on the hull of the vessel. What's interesting also to reflect on, I think, is the power of the engines that are involved in propelling these types of vessels. And if we convert those power outputs to megawatt equivalents, a large merchant ship might have 10 megawatts or 100 megawatts of power being emitted from the propeller. If perhaps, and this is for the sake of argument, 10% of that energy is transmitted into the water as noise, then the noise-power relationship would be somewhere between 100 kilowatts and 10 megawatts. And that's quite a considerable amount of noise-related power that's going into the sea. If we move on to look at the support vessels, which are used to help put devices, marine energy devices in the water, the source levels of these boats are probably going to be much lower, and the source power levels of workboats are around 1 megawatt to 10 megawatts. Now this is an order of magnitude less than the big merchant vessels. If we look at, say, 10% of the power from these vessels being transmitted into noise, then likewise we have a tenfold decrease in the amount of noise associated with these vessels. So the noise output could be considered to be around 100 kilowatts to 1 megawatt. If we go on then to look at ocean energy devices, the source levels for these types of devices are generally less than 80 decibels. And I've used 80 decibels because in Europe this is the threshold when workers have to use ear defenders to do work in a machinery space, or if you were working on a site. And if you go and work around the marine energy devices that we have today, you don't really ever need to put on ear defenders to work in those environments. So it's pretty clear that these devices are well below the threshold of 80 decibels. If we look at the source power associated with these devices, then they currently range from about 100 kilowatts to, say, 2 megawatts at a maximum. But here, instead of producing energy which is transmitted into the sea, these devices are actually absorbing energy from the sea, and so they have a much lower threshold of noise conversion, and we're suggesting that that noise conversion rate is probably somewhere between 0.1% and 0.5% of the power output of those devices, and therefore the noise power emitted from them is probably nearer 10 watts to 10 kilowatts depending on the size of the device, and that's significantly lower, a number of orders of magnitude lower than is arising from the vessels. Now, there's also what I've called perhaps near-silent technologies. There are some devices where the mechanics of them are incredibly simple. They don't have many moving parts. There's no engine as such in the water. And here's some examples of Open Hydro's Open Center Turbine from Ireland, which just has a spinning disc as a moving part in the water. Here we've got something called the Penguin from Finland, which has actually got a flywheel in the middle of it. And here's another tidal device, the Flue Mill Power Tower, with a helical screw which generates the power. This has a very low turning velocity. And these devices are actually virtually near silent in the water. And the important thing is that when people say that we're not sure about what levels of noise may come from devices, there's a balance of probability that we have to think of. And from our analysis, the balance of probability lies much more to the fact that these devices are going to have low noise levels than they are going to have high noise levels. And that's because these devices, if they're emitting noise, it suggests they're inefficient, it suggests that they are losing energy, and therefore there'll be a natural tendency towards these devices being quiet. So what I wanted to do was just compare a set of circumstances at a site in Scotland. It's called EMEC, the European Marine Energy Centre, and this is where some of the first wave energy devices have been deployed. And what I wanted to do was to compare the noise levels that you could assume are generated from the test site versus a local ferry that sails by 6 times a day, and then looking at the noise that might be generated through natural processes in the sea. And you can see the way we've built this up. We've started with a number of generators. We've looked at the mechanical loss. We've then looked at the transmitted noise loss into the sea and looked at the energy conversion of that. And then we've multiplied that amount of energy by the number of hours that the device is in the water, and in this case the capacity factor as a surrogate for the efficiency or the power output of the device. And what this shows is that the accumulated noise output from EMEC is likely to be in the region of 100,000 kilowatt hours. If we look at the ferry and do a similar calculation, and here the vessel's passing the area for about 1 hour in the day through each of the 6 passages, then the accumulated power output is considerably higher. It's about 23 times higher, and here are the simple factors. And then if we look at natural noise and look at the amount of energy passing through this area, and perhaps look at it hitting the coast as surf, then the amount of power that's involved in that is phenomenally greater, and perhaps here 870 times greater than the power associated with the devices themselves. So I think this again illustrates the balance of probability. The likelihood is that at this site the natural noise levels will be dominant. They'll then be followed up by the ferry, which passes 6 times a day, and a very low noise level will be associated with the devices. And the early monitoring that's been done on the site has confirmed these trends. In terms of then what could be done to research into noise, and I think again here I've gone back to this architecture of going from existing noise sources to consequences. Research can be undertaken at all stages, but the straightforward studies can be taken more around noise sources, actually determining effects and impacts where you're dealing with animals that really can't speak to us, and it's very difficult to know how they're responding. These are very complex and difficult studies. And in terms of the industry that we're looking at here, the ocean energy industry, it isn't responsible for answering all of the questions we have about noise. And so just because we can study these issues doesn't mean that the industry, I believe, should be encumbered by those studies. I think the industry needs to be responsible for generating information about the noise that it's creating. And that relates then into the monitoring programs on the next slide, which...
Gareth, 5-minute warning, and audience, if you have questions, now's a great time to start submitting them. We have a couple in, but if you have additional questions, it'd be a great time to send them in.
Okay. In terms of managing noise, again, what we would be contending is that you can manage noise much more easily at this end in terms of design and associated with the source noise, rather than trying to manage noise once it's emitted into the water. Simple things like where you put your devices, where you put your array are the biggest mitigation tool in terms of the management of the consequences of noise, but we can do a lot to choose amplitudes and frequencies, eradicate noise at source if that's indeed felt to be true or beneficial. I just wanted to reflect on some of the ways that we can use noise and present information about noise. And here, looking at noise maps, and this is something that's gaining some traction in Europe. But I think, and I've used as an example here some diagrams from Cornell University's research, where they've got whales vocalizing in an area and then a ship steaming by. And these maps are really interesting, I think, for starting to help us understand the context of noise. One of the issues for ocean energy devices is that we're probably less intense. Each device would be less intense, for example, than the amount of noise emitted from a whale, and certainly much less than that emitted from a large ship. And here you can see some work vessels indicated as the type of noise that might be associated with them. So just moving on to a final two slides. The point of this is to show that we have some time to resolve these noise issues. This is an indication of the build-out rate that you could foresee under an optimistic scenario, perhaps for wave energy and tidal stream devices around the world. And it's basically saying that over the next 3, 4, 5 years, the numbers of devices that are going to go in are relatively small. So we have a period of time when we can go and look at the source noises of these devices and check that they're not so noisy that they're incomparable with our existing sources of noise. And then we can apply that knowledge to the deployment of the full arrays. We don't have to worry about the implications of these full arrays at this early stage. So in terms of predicting impacts, we need to use the established evidence about noise levels. We need to map out the certainties of what we know. And what we know most about is the levels of noise that are coming from the machines we're putting in the water. We certainly need to catalog uncertainties, but we don't need to go and answer all of those uncertainties now. I believe we need to look at the balance of probability and see where that lies on all the issues. And for sure we need to investigate any areas of major concern, but in doing that we need to test that investigation against all the other priorities that we have for monitoring. And the big question is underwater noise associated with ocean energy the most important thing for us to be looking at and spending precious resources on? And finally, almost finally, looking at key management issues of noise. How can we make the whales, the animals in the sea happy? Well, there's a number of things that we can do. We can avoid noise if possible. We can reduce its intensity. We can understand the species that are present and the sensitivities that are present and ensure that how we're doing our activities, when we're doing our activities, make them as benign as possible. One of the things I've said here is that nowhere does it say we need to establish background noise levels nor monitor noise level outputs in the longer term, because I think these are incredibly difficult things to do. We don't require them of other industries that are working in the sea, and therefore I don't think the wave and tidal industry should be encumbered with those activities at the present time. In terms of monitoring noise and deployment, therefore, we don't believe we should stop doing things until we've basically made certainties out of all the uncertainties. We think we know an awful lot about underwater noise. What we should do is proceed with caution. Underwater noise shouldn't be a showstopper for most places and for most projects. And one of the reasons for that is to remember that we're not working in a benign environment. Our existing energy systems, which marine energy is trying to replace, have an impact on our world, have an impact on our oceans. And so we're not starting from a baseline that doesn't have any problems. And that's an important context to understand in all of the debate that we have about ocean energy. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Gareth. Right on time. We have a number of questions coming in, and several of them are in reference to references. One requesting a reference for your decibel scale being used. Another one asking for a little more information on some of the devices you mentioned. I'm going to have those ones sent to you, that you can answer them in writing, and I'll try to ask you some of the more discussion-oriented questions, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So one of the first ones was just more of a clarification, and that is you mentioned 80 decibels as being a threshold for ear protection. And there were some questions about whether or not that was in reference to 80 decibels in air or in water, and how what the differences might be.
Yeah.
Those two things.
Okay, so there are differences between noise in air and noise in water. Those thresholds are in relation to noise in air, and it's not a direct comparator, but I think we felt that it gives you a benchmark against which you can test. One of the things that technology developers are looking for is, what are the early rules of thumb or indicators whether they've got a problem or not. Well, for example, one rule of thumb is that if you have to wear ear defenders when your machine is operating or when you're in the machine when it's operating, then noise could potentially be an issue for you. If you don't have to do that, then it's very unlikely that you're going to be generating noise in any way, which is going to be a wider problem in the environment. So it's not an accurate, precise measure. It's an indicative measure of whether you might have a problem or not.
Great. There's a second question around, you made the comparison that a full array may be equivalent to a large merchant ship in terms of noise and noise energy. And the question was, your talk focused on sort of pilot scale single devices. What about having a commercial array built out and having that kind of equivalent noise energy in place as sort of a static source of noise rather than moving to the sea? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a very important part of it. The interesting aspect of that is that most places where we've got large ships, there's a number of them because there'll be a port that they're heading to, and therefore, you might get ships passing every day or even every hour. Obviously, if these devices are there all the time, that's a static form of noise. Within the impact assessment process, you would then look at things like, is a more static source of noise less or more intrusive into the environment than perhaps something which is more periodic like shipping, and that's still an open question. I think some of the other presenters, are going to get into some of the nuts and bolts of this, but I just wanted to try and give some kind of comparative context for the noise levels that might come from ocean energy devices in relation to other activities that we currently find acceptable in the ocean.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. And for those of you who asked questions that we didn't get to, we'll have Gareth get back to you in writing. The last question I have here is, how did you estimate that between 0.01 and 0.5% of the power MHK devices are extracting is converted to acoustic power?
It was looking at a range of circumstantial evidence, so it's not an analysis. It's a best estimate, and it's something that could be investigated further.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Gareth. That was an excellent kickoff, and thanks for calling in from Scotland and for leading us off while rushing in late. So I appreciate it.
No, and I'm sorry about that. It was just my day got a bit frantic at the end, but obviously people will appreciate it's getting pretty late here, so I'm going to sign off, and but I will be online answering the questions that people pose.
Perfect. Thank you, Gareth. So our next speaker is also coming to us from the UK. John Harwood from the University of St. Andrews will be discussing, the title of his talk is Assessing the Population Level Impacts of Acoustic Disturbance Associated with Marine Energy Devices on Marine Organisms. So John, if you're with us, same thing as Gareth, Anna will be controlling your slides. I'll give you a 5-minute warning, and we will have a Q&A. So John, are you with us?
I am indeed, yes.
Okay, take it away.
Thanks very much indeed for that introduction, and Simon. And thanks to Gareth for a great talk that I think gives you the context for what I'm going to be talking about, because you remember that Gareth showed in a couple of slides this link between existing sources and sort of environmental consequences of that sound production. And what I'm going to be dealing with is the far right-hand side of that diagram, what goes from detection of sounds by living organisms to the effect it might have on their populations. So I'm going to be talking about how you can consider the population level impacts of acoustic disturbance associated with a whole variety of marine energy devices, but I'm going to try and focus on MHK in this talk. So this is a talk that's really the output of a working group that's been funded by the US Office of Naval Research on the population consequences of acoustic disturbance that I've been chairing for the last 2.5 years now. Could I have the next slide, please, Anna? And I'm also going to try and build on some experiences we've had here in the UK, where there's already one operational tidal energy device, and many of you, I think, will have heard Carol Sparling, also from St Andrews, describe the marine mammal monitoring that's been carried out in relation to that device in a webinar in this series on August 29th. And there are several other of those devices that are likely to go in and be operational over the next couple of years. On top of that, as Gareth indicated, there are a lot more devices that have been licensed. So we're likely to see quite a big growth in those devices in UK waters over the next decade or so. Now, the primary environmental concern about those devices has been injury to marine mammals associated with the moving parts of those devices. But obviously, there's concern as well that the noise, both during construction and in operation, could be an issue. Next slide, please, Anna. So there are a lot of ways in which exposure to noise can change the behaviour of individual animals, but even if it does change them, does it really matter? The main concern in legislation, both in the UK and in the US, is does that really have any consequences at the population level? Does it affect the vital rates of the populations that could be impacted? So that's things like survival and rate of reproduction. And here's a really rather long list of the way in which changes in behaviour could affect those vital rates. I won't go through them all because I think a lot of them are not really relevant to the noise that's generated by MHK devices. Can I have the next slide, please, Anna? So what I've highlighted here is the three areas where I think there might be an issue. So this steady production of noise that Gareth talked about could lead to shifts in migration. So animals could just bypass these devices, and that could mean that they're swimming further on their migration routes. But it could also exclude them from areas that are important for food and perhaps make them swim faster. And those all have impacts on their energy budgets, how much energy they use and how much energy they can take in. Next slide, please. Now, fortunately, there's a framework in which we can analyze these potential impacts. It was drawn up by a special working group of the US National Research Council as part of a report they put out on marine mammal populations and ocean noise. And they called this the PCAD diagram, the population consequences of acoustic disturbance. And you can see it goes from sound production through changes in the behavior of the animals that might be affected, to the impact that might have on their life functions, and then through to the vital rates like survival and reproduction, and on to population effects, changes in the actual abundance of the organisms that might be impacted. Next slide, please, Anna. Now, at the time that the committee produced its report, which was 5 or 6 years ago, they felt that we were a decade away from making the data, getting hold of the data and understanding the mechanisms that are involved in this. But recent advances in statistical analysis and modelling have actually made this possible now, and a group of us were able to persuade the Office of Naval Research that they should go ahead and fund a working group to try and actually develop this model structure and use it to try and work out what the population consequences of some forms of disturbance might be. And you can imagine the Navy's main concern is about the impact its sonars might be having on marine mammals in the world's oceans. Next slide, please, Anna. So what made it possible for us to persuade ONR to go ahead like this? Well, it's two things. One is a set of conceptual and statistical approaches that allow us to look at these things, and they resolve around something called state space modeling. Now, usually when scientists, particularly biologists, talk about the kind of work they do, they say, well, you know, this is all quite complicated, but it's not rocket science. Well, actually, what we're using here is rocket science. These state space models were developed for tracking and intercepting intercontinental ballistic missiles, where you've got lots of data coming in all the time and you want to be able to predict what's going to happen. And that's the kind of situation we're in with the systems we're trying to model here. So we've been able to build on these very sophisticated statistical models that are being built up. And we've also been able to bypass one of the really fundamental issues in biology, and particularly sort of ecology, which is that most mathematical models of animal populations assume that all the individuals in the population are identical. Now that's pretty dumb. All we know suggests that individuals vary. And it's something that's in public health sciences called the ecological fallacy. Ecologists are pretty dumb about this, but fortunately we've developed techniques to take account of differences between individuals now, using something that's got the very fancy name of hierarchical Bayesian analysis. Could I have the next slide, please, Anna? So the way that these state space models work is you have models that tell you how, for example, the number of individuals in the population change from time to time, given a model that's covered by the box A. Next slide, please, Anna. And on top of that, you've got a set of observations about what's going on in the population. And the trick with state space modeling is that you can use those observations, which may not actually be direct observations of things you're interested in, to tell you what's going on in the population and to help you understand the mechanisms that are involved. And it's that very sophisticated mathematical structure that we've been taking advantage of in this ONR working group. Next slide, please, Anna. So that working group has considered 4 case studies where there appears to be enough data to begin constructing suitable models that cover the 2 major breeding strategies of marine mammals. Well, what are those? Next slide, please, Anna. So there are animals that are called capital breeders, and most seals fall into that category, where they build up reserves during most of the year, and then they rely on the fat that they've stored as a result of all their feeding to turn into milk to feed their offspring. So seals, almost all seals do this, and a lot of the big whales do. But there are some other species that don't rely on building up great big reserves and depend on getting food all the way through the time they're raising their young. And that's species like sea lions and fur seals and most of the dolphins. So those are income breeders, and the ones that can build up their reserves over a long period are called capital breeders. So you can imagine that disturbance to an income breeder during the breeding season is going to have a much bigger impact than disturbance to a capital breeder outside the breeding season, because those animals can always make up the lost time by feeding more intensively at other times of year. Next slide, please, Anna. So we work closely with people who've got data on these case studies and invited them to our workshops to help us develop these models. And we've looked at 4 case studies, as I mentioned. The first one was looking at all species of seal, fur seals, and sea lions, but in the end we focused on 2 species, the northern and the southern elephant seals, and as we'll see in a minute, that's because there's so much data available on those species. Then we looked at coastal populations of bottlenose dolphins, particularly, in fact, data that's been collected in Sarasota Bay down in Florida. Then we went on to look at North Atlantic right whales, and in fact one of the main driving forces for the Cornell University analysis that Gareth showed in one of his slides, you remember he showed these little sort of winking lights of noise produced by whales and noise produced by vessels. That's right in the center of the range of the North Atlantic right whale, and that data was collected in part to protect North Atlantic right whales from boat collisions. And finally, we looked at beaked whales, which are a very hard to study group of animals, but which appear to have been quite badly impacted in some areas by naval exercises. Next slide, please, Anna. So we took this PCAD conceptual framework that I showed you before, developed by the National Research Council. Next slide, please, Anna. And we focused on the middle part of that diagram. How does behavioral change affect life function, and how does life function affect vital rates? And what we realized after a couple of meetings was that we could simplify this diagram and extend it to some of the other issues that are important, not just behaviour, but other aspects of the biology of the animals that might be impacted. Next slide, please, Anna. So at our last meeting, which was just over a month ago, we realized we could go from PCAD, population consequences of acoustic disturbance, to population consequences of disturbance in general, PCoD as we now call it. And here's the framework we developed. So you've got disturbance that could change the behavior of animal, but it might influence its physiology as well. It might change its hormone production, it might get stressed, and that could have an impact on its behavior. And similarly, if changes in behavior can affect hormones and stress. And in acute situations, those changes can have an immediate effect on vital rates. Animals might die because they do something really stupid. They might die because they're stressed. But most of the time, the effects are chronic, just as they are with humans that are subject to acoustic disturbance and noise. They affect health, and only gradually does that affect vital rates. So we need to look at both the health effects and the direct effects on vital rates, and then we can look at the population dynamic effects, which are actually much better understood than any of the other links in this diagram. Next slide, please, Anna. So how do we cope with all these complicated situations? Well, first of all, we identified the pathways by which the anticipated changes in behavior in response to disturbance might work their through to vital rates. Are they likely to be direct impacts, or are they likely to be chronic impacts through condition, and then on to vital rates? Next slide, please, Anna. And then we developed these fancy state space models of each pathway and looked to see if we had data that would allow us to estimate the parameters of those models. And then we made up data, because we weren't sure how much was out there, to see whether you could actually estimate those parameters using the kind of data that we thought was available. Next slide, please, Anna. And if those simulation exercises indicated that we could go through with that, we actually fitted those models to the data. But if we were not convinced that the data was going to be sufficient, we developed simulation models that we could use just as to look through different scenarios about how disturbance might impact vital rates given the mechanisms we thought might be involved. Next slide, please, Anna. And then, of course, once you've run through those scenarios, you go on to the thing that really matters in terms of legislation. What proportion of the local population might be impacted by the particular disturbances we're looking at, and do those changes have a consequence at the population level? Next slide, please, Anna. So I'm going to take you through in a little bit of detail what we did with elephant seals, and I'll be quite brief in what I say about the other case studies, because the elephant seals are the ones we looked at first, and we've made most progress with this species. So elephant seals are capital breeders, and they have an incredibly simple life cycle. They come ashore to breed. The females stay ashore for the whole time they're looking after their pups. After about 3 or 4 weeks, they abandon the pups, go off to feed, spend 3 or 4 months at sea, come back to exactly the same place to molt their fur, go off to sea again, and it's during this period that they put on all the blubber that they're going to use to feed their next pup, and then a year later they come back to breed again. So it's very easy to catch these animals and to attach transmitters on them that can provide information on where they go, but also on what they're doing. And the diving behavior of these animals is such that we can actually use it to estimate how fat they are. So we can collect that information all the time they're at sea and interpret that data to see when they're putting on weight and when they're losing it. Then we can capture them again when they come back, find out exactly how fat they are, and then we can follow what happens to their pups, both while the mothers are feeding them and then when the pups go to sea. And what those studies have revealed is that the survival of pups is strongly dependent on how much milk their mothers give them, and how much milk the mothers give them depends on how fat the females are when they come ashore. So female body condition at the end of that second foraging period is critical to determining pup survival. So anything that affects that is going to affect the subsequent survival of the pup. Next slide, please, Anna.
And John, this is Simon. About a 5-minute warning, and for our audience, great time to start submitting questions.
Thanks very much, Simon. So here's the way that what we know about elephant seals fits into that PCoD framework. So disturbance might affect the foraging behavior of the animals. That might mean that they don't feed, And it might mean that they spend more time traveling. If they're moving away from acoustic disturbance, they're going to spend more time traveling, and because of that, they can't feed so much. And that has a direct impact on the condition, because if an animal that's disturbed, there'll be less fat when she comes home. And it turns out, by analysing all the data we've got on the species, and in this diagram, by the way, the left-hand animal in that group actually has one of the transmitters I was talking about stuck onto the top of its head. So that's what it looks like. What we now know from studies of these populations is that if you disturb these animals for a few days during the year, yes, it affects condition, but it has really a very marginal effect on pup survival. But if you disturb them too much, their condition falls below a critical threshold, and if they go that far, they don't breed at all. And it's that that has the real impact on the dynamics of the population. So essentially, up to a certain level, disturbance has an effect on condition. It has a very small effect on population dynamics. But if you move beyond that threshold, then you really run into problems with fecundity, and that can really affect the population dynamics of the species. Next slide, please, Anna. Coastal bottlenose dolphins are an income breeder rather than a capital breeder. Again, there are fantastic long-term studies of this species, particularly at Sarasota Bay in Florida, but also at two other sites, in Doubtful Sound in New Zealand and Shark Bay in Australia. And it's surprising given how big bottlenose dolphins are, but they seem to spend an awful lot of their time trying to avoid being attacked by sharks, and this really constrains their behaviour. And what studies, particularly in New Zealand and Australia, have shown is that if you disturb animals, in this case with tourist boats, that disruption can mean that they feed less and are in poorer condition, and that has direct implications for how often they breed and for the survival of their young. Next slide, please, Anna. And we built up really quite a complicated model of how disturbance might impact those behaviours, and how, because bottlenose dolphins are social animals, they interact with each other. And we're fitting those models now to data from the three locations that I described in relation to the previous slide. Next slide, please, Anna. So here's the PCoD model again for bottlenose dolphins, and you can see it really has rather similar effects to elephant seal. Disturbance can affect nurturing, the behaviour of the female towards her young, and how much time it spends feeding. And the population consequences are that disturbed animals might produce fewer young, and those that do produce young, the young might not survive as well. Next slide, please. So the third case study is North Atlantic right whales. This is a highly endangered species, but there's another species which has also been studied in a lot of detail, which is really doing very well, the South Atlantic right whale. And there's a fantastic set of databases that are curated by the Northern Right Whale Consortium in Boston. And we're just starting to develop our models of this species, but it's subject to a lot more threats than just acoustic disturbance. And so the models have to be much more sophisticated, because we have to consider the context of all the other forms of disturbance, interactions with humans that these whales can be subject to. So that's the really complicated situation that Gareth was talking about in his talk. Next slide, please, Anna. And finally, we have the beaked whales. It's another species that's primarily an income breeder. We've now got detailed information on how these animals react to noise produced by Navy sonars and other artificial noise, and we're building on long-term population studies of this species to look at how they might be impacted by the disturbance that goes with Navy exercises. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, we've made, I think, fantastic progress on developing these models, much more than anybody really expected. There are some interesting take-home messages that arise from it. One is that this idea that animals might be displaced by noise and therefore at greater risk of predation doesn't seem to be an issue. Basically, these animals are so scared of being attacked by other predators, which are mostly sharks or killer whales, that they're not going to change their distribution just because of noise. What they will do is change the way they behave. And the result of that change in behavior is likely to be a reduction in energy intake because they're feeding less, or an increase in energy expenditure because they're spending more time traveling and avoiding noise, but also avoiding predators. So the models we're building now are mostly energetics models of how the energy budgets and the time budgets of animals might change as a result of all forms of acoustic disturbance and other kinds of disturbance. And that's allowing us to draw some inference about how noise from all kinds of energy devices in the ocean, not just MHK ones, but one thing that we're very worried about at the moment is the potential noise that goes with the construction of offshore wind farms, because those farms are mostly constructed by banging very large pieces of metal into the substrate, and that definitely creates a lot of noise that could be disturbing. So I'm very happy now to answer any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you, John. We have about 3 or 4 minutes for questions, and we had some themes developing, so I'll try to link some of the questions together. And for those that we don't get to, we'll ask you to answer them in written form. First one was looking at a question around whether your group had looked at specifically quantifying the decibel level that does cause disturbance.
That's not been the focus of our research, but it's starting to emerge. And in fact, that's coming out from a lot of the work that's been funded because of the concern about the impact of Navy sonars. And it turns out that for some of the more sensitive species, like harbour porpoises, which Brian, I think, is going to be talking about in the next presentation, they will react to relatively low levels of sound. So we're talking about sound exposure levels, so that's a sort of integrated measure of sound exposure underwater of about 145 decibels. And the same kind of threshold seems to apply to the big whales that I was talking about in relation to the penultimate slide. Those seem to leave Navy ranges when they get received levels of around 140, 145 decibels. That doesn't apply to all species, but certainly some species will react at those relatively low underwater sound levels.
Great, and then sort of a follow-up or a next step on that, and this is sort of another question that maybe you haven't considered as a group, but have you thought about at what point or what types of appropriate mitigation might be taken to reduce impacts to marine mammals from a noise response, or has that been something that you just hasn't really been thought of in your model yet, and it's sort of a question for another project?
We haven't really considered mitigation, but and again, this is something that Gareth touched on in his talk. One of the ways to mitigate the effects is basically to avoid putting noise into the water at times when the highest densities of animals are around, because many of these animals have highly seasonal distributions, and in that case you can program the highest noise production to take place at the times when there are fewest animals around. The other thing that other people are looking at is sensitivity to the characteristics of the noise. So noise that's rough, that contains lots of sort of sharp edges, seems to provoke more reaction than continuous noise that's at a constant level. So those are things that can be done. And in terms of MHK devices, I suspect the fact that they're mostly producing continuous noise without much variation means that they're going to have less impact than some of the devices that I was talking about, sonars and piling noise from wind turbines.
Great. And a final question that you might be helpful to write in for all of us to see, but there's a question about whether or not there's a more detailed version of your state-based model that's been published somewhere that we can look at offline later.
Yes, there are several papers on that, and I can refer people to websites where you can get access to that documentation.
All right. Well, I think we're out of time. So thank you so much, John. That was excellent. And please do take a look at the questions. There were a couple I didn't get to. So thank you very much. And our next speaker, I see Anna is loading up the presentation now, will be Dr. Brian Pelagi from the University of Washington. And Brian will be talking about research at the Northwest National Marine Renewable Energy Center and other places through Sea Mammal Research Unit to just look at estimating the marine mammal response to noise from a tidal energy project. And Brian, I feel like I'm constantly introducing you for things, so please take it away.
Thank you, Simon. Can everyone hear me okay? Am I coming through at all?
Brian, thanks.
Okay, great. So, what I'm going to be talking about today today is a study that we undertook over the last year to try to tie together some of the themes that both Gareth and John have touched on in their talks to try to estimate the marine mammal response to noise from a tidal energy project, specifically Open Hydro Snohomish PUD partnership in Northern Admiralty Inlet of Puget Sound. Just a few overall comments on this work. First of all, it's a work in progress. None of this has yet been through peer review or publication, so certainly as you have comments about the methods we've used or the procedure we're taking, I'd be very curious to have your feedback on this. All the figures I'm going to discuss here in terms of sound pressure levels are broadband levels. A more nuanced approach could certainly include some sort of weighting, either boxcar weighting or M weighting. And then the last point is that this is all really at this point a thought exercise, and all the conclusions that we're seeing here really should be verified post-installation, but certainly give some good insight into the limitations and the effectiveness of post-installation studies. So this is work that I've carried out along with Rob Cavagnaro, Chris Bassett at the University of Washington, and then Jason Wood and Dom Toll at the Sea Mammal Research Unit. So next slide, please. So the motivation for this, I think everyone's touched on this in the last two talks, is that the noise from tidal turbine operation may disturb marine mammals, but there's certainly a very high uncertainty around the nature of this behavioral response. Certainly the response of individuals in a population is not uniquely determined by an instantaneous received sound level. Resolving some of this uncertainty for MHK projects certainly involves a degree of monitoring of pilot scale projects to try to provide information about this interaction, but we do need to be mindful that given economic constraints, the monitoring studies that are done at pilot projects should have a high probability of actually detecting a behavioral response associated with the operation or installation of devices, not simply providing additional, I would say, baseline information about marine mammal activity and behavior in the general area of these projects. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of the specific project. The case I'm talking about is in Northern Admiralty Inlet of Puget Sound. The figure you're seeing inset on the right there is the bathymetry in the general project area. Water depth varies from about, in the near shore area, from about 20 meters down to over 100 meters. The turbines, the pair of turbines, which you can see an image of over to the left, are proposed to be deployed about 1 kilometer to the west of Admiralty Head. That's that brown shaded landmass. And the study site I'm going to be talking about is about 1 kilometer east of that, directly south of Keystone Harbor. That's a keystone-shaped in-cut into Admiralty Head. Next slide. So the first question, as we've been going through some of these pre-installation studies, is there is a very high level of porpoise presence at this site, more so than there has been at other tidal energy projects. And so one of the early questions has been whether we could use this relatively high abundance of harbor porpoise to understand the effects on a broader range of marine mammals from project operation. In this case, we've been monitoring presence and absence solely using Chelonia CPods. These are a passive acoustic device that detects echolocation activity and then classifies it post-detection by the specific type of marine mammal that generated the signal. So obviously, we can't use this to get at absolute levels of abundance or really overall activity that doesn't necessarily involve echolocation, but it's certainly a good indicator of the degree of presence and absence. And the way we classify that presence and absence is by detection positive minutes. That's a minute in which the CPOD detects an echolocation that's classified then as harbor porpoise. And in the bottom left, you're seeing a sample over 9 days of detection positive minutes per hour. You can see a very kind of clear daily pattern in the received detections. There's certainly more at night than in the morning. And if you go and look over an entire year, so this is data collected from the site from May 2010 through May 2011, there's certainly a lot of variability. There may be some seasonal trends there, but in general, there doesn't look like there's a single factor that describes really the extent of echolocation activity. So one of the first questions we started asking was, well, are harbor porpoises actually going to be present when these devices are operating? So next slide. And the approach we took to looking at this is something called a generalized linear model. I won't spend too much time on the details of this here, but the general idea is that you're using a regression to fit a number of predictors you're using a number of predictors to try to estimate some observed value. In this case, you're trying to fit detection positive minutes per hour to a distribution of predictors that are described by some exponential function. And the predictors might be things like, is it day, is it night, is it spring, is it fall, what's the tidal current velocity, how much power might a device operating in this area be extracting, what's the ambient noise level, and all of this is described by a negative binomial distribution. You're seeing the distribution of data and the negative binomial there on the right. So I won't say more about GLM, but certainly a very powerful tool for looking for underlying trends. Next slide. And the result here is that the GLM actually didn't do a particularly good job of explaining why we were seeing particular detection positive minutes. So that could be that our set of predictors is not all inclusive. Certainly, we do not have as a predictor here the density of herring in the immediate vicinity of the sea pods. But certainly, it does provide some indication that harbor porpoise will be present through all stages of the tide, meaning that they will be present whenever the device, during periods of device operation. And so the idea of using them as a marker species for marine mammal behavior certainly seems to have some validity. The table here is showing the various kind of results of the different parameters in the GLM. So each predictor is shown in the first column, and then the amount that the residual deviance, that's the amount of information that is unexplained by the model, is improved by each predictor, is shown there on the right-hand column. And you can see things like current velocity. There's a negative correlation with harbor porpoise presence and current velocity, and night and day variation. Presence is positively correlated with nighttime hours. There is some correlation there, but it certainly doesn't explain the vast majority of the underlying trends. So certainly this is an interesting exercise to go through, but it seems like the population is, or the presence of harbor porpoise is largely controlled by factors that we're not including presently in the GLM. So next slide. So if we know the harbor porpoise are likely to be present in the area, then what's the effect, the probable effect of turbine noise? And we might take some of the synthesis information from Southall to say that harbor porpoises would be expected to display avoidance to high received levels of noise. Specifically, exposures exceeding 140 decibels broad band have been shown in a number of studies to result in sustained avoidance behavior. Now, a subtlety here is that tidal turbines are not likely to produce a constant level of noise output over all of their device states. Certainly, when the turbines are not rotating, one would expect the devices to produce very little noise, and at full power output, more noise. So if we adopt a very simple model for turbine power, for turbine noise, relating the noise generated by turbine to relating the noise generated by the turbine to the amount of power that it's extracting from the flow, we can work up a probability distribution of how much noise these devices might make. So again, this is a specific case of two 6-meter open hydro turbines deployed off of Admiralty Head in Puget Sound. And the data that's informing this is measurements of a similar 6-meter device deployed at the European Marine Energy Center. So on the left side, you're seeing the results for the 75th operating percentile. That's the amount of noise in broadband SPL that would be produced by the project 25% of the time. At least that much noise is generated 25% of the time. And you can see there that the noise levels in the 75th percentile are actually still relatively low. In general, we see some excursions up to 140 dB right around the turbines, but that kind of zone of potential responsiveness is actually relatively small. If we move all the way up to the 99th operating percentile, then the noise from the turbines certainly does look a bit louder, and the black line there is denoting the 120 dB isobel. That's the current threshold for harassment of marine mammals. So there's some indication that maybe when the turbines are operating at very high power output, that there might be some sort of disturbance here. And it's interesting to look at this from the standpoint of understanding both what would happen if you deployed a much larger array of turbines, but also the question of whether this is likely to cause abandonment of this area by harbor porpoise if they're periodically exposed to noise at this level. So this is where some of the regulatory concerns come from in the project, and certainly if we think about how we might want to develop a post-installation monitoring plan, these are the sort of questions that it seems like it would make sense to start to investigate. So next slide. So harkening back to Gareth's talk, we decided to take a step back and ask the question of, well, what effect are the existing passenger ferries having on the harbor porpoise population at this site, using the passenger ferry as a pre-installation source of opportunity to basically prototype a post-installation study of a tidal turbine. In this case, the passenger ferry has a broadband source level of about 173 dB, That's actually quite loud in comparison to even the 99th percentile operating case for the pair of turbines. And the source is present in the effective receiving proximity of the CPOD for about a minute. So the idea here is to monitor echolocation activity as a proxy for potential avoidance behavior, focusing on temporal trends. And those two trends are looking at once the last passenger ferry outbound from Keystone Harbor has passed through this area at night, how long does it take until we see our next echolocation event? So is there, is this kind of an avoidance behavior on the order of minutes or more than an hour? And then look at the sort of decrease associated with the first inbound ferry passage. So porpoise are present at the site during the morning hours, the ferry comes in, does that lead to a decrease in echolocation activity? So at a broad level, a ferry plus a population of porpoises yields what sort of response? Next slide. So the first question which has been asked is a ferry like a turbine? Which you could argue is very similar to the canonical question, is a raven like a writing desk? And the indications are that this is a reasonably suitable analog. So what I'm showing here are acoustic spectra of a turbine operating at 14 RPM. That corresponds to about the 75th operating percentile, matched up against a ferry, a cargo ship, and a tanker at roughly equivalent distances. And you can see here that the noise from the turbine, in terms of intensity, is relatively lower than the shipping noise. The spectral content of the noise is actually relatively similar. It's a red spectrum rolling off at higher frequencies. And so certainly the ferry noise is louder than the turbine noise. The turbine noise will be more continuous than the ferry noise. But if we're thinking about just looking at those really peak events where the turbine is operating at its 99th percentile, then that question of the continuous versus the discontinuous source may be somewhat muted. And again, all this data is from the turbine noise, courtesy of Open Hydro and measurements obtained by the Scottish Association for Marine Science. So next slide. So the way we try to monitor this is much the same way that we might think about monitoring a pilot project involving a tidal turbine. So again, the inset map is showing the project area off of Admiralty Head. The turbine site is about 1 kilometer west. The study site is about 1 kilometer east. There's an AIS receiver that's an automatic identification system receiver deployed on the Washington State Park Lighthouse on Admiralty Head that monitors both the ferry traffic in the area as well as the other shipping traffic in the area. So we can control for cases where the ferry passes by and then maybe another large vessel passes in close proximity and re-insonifies the site. So we want to control for those sort of situations. And then at the actual study site, we deploy one of the Nemric Sea Spiders. This one equipped with an ADCP to monitor the currents at that location, Chelonia CPOD to monitor porpoise echolocation activity, and a broadband hydrophone to monitor ambient noise levels and also develop some information about the source level associated with the passenger ferry. So next slide. So thinking about the ferry as an acoustic stressor, on the left side, I'm showing the measured ferry positions as reported by the AIS. At the center of that red dotted circle that denotes the CPOD's effective range, there's the CPOD that's been deployed. The dashed blue lines denote the ferry tracks. These are outbound ferry tracks through the project area. And the blue circles denote the closest point of approach. And we think about the sort of received levels in the CPOD's detection range at that closest point of approach. That's shown on that figure to the right there. I'm using the same sort of received level scale as I showed previously for the estimated turbine noise. And you can see that within the receiving range of the CPOD, when the ferry is at its closest point of approach, it's quite loud, and received levels generally exceed 140 decibels within the received area of the CPOD. So the ferry is definitely quite loud, and we'd expect to see some sort of response. So next slide.
And Brian, you got a little bit more than 5-minute warning.
And I should have not more than 5 minutes to go, so I think we're in good shape. So the first question is there a strong behavioral change? So do we see that harbor porpoises have abandoned this site entirely? And the answer is no. We see porpoise activity levels at this location that are quite similar to the levels that we're monitoring further off of Admiralty Head at the turbine site. So that question of would periodic kind of turbine noise getting up into that 140 dB range result in kind of porpoise abandonment of the area, and that seems unlikely. The second strong effect we looked at was, are porpoises leaving the area when the when the ferry passes through and then coming back. That's measured as a function of latency. So what we're looking at here on this plot is the time after the ferry passes until the next porpoise echolocation click is detected. And you can see here that in 60% of the cases after the ferry passes, we have echolocation activity either during ferry passage or within the first 10 minutes after ferry passage. And so the answer to that first question is that there does not appear to be an extended period of inactivity after the ferry passes. So if we go to the next slide. A more subtle question might be, do we see a dip in activity as the ferry passes that then recovers? So in this plot, we're looking at of the 32 cases where we had an inbound ferry, first ferry of the morning, where there was not other vessels in the area, how many of those 32 cases at each kind of minute up until the ferry's arrival and then after it passes do we see echolocation activity? And the general answer is that we see kind of just a broad scatter in activity. We don't see a distinct trend, and we don't see a distinct dip when the ferry passes, even though noise in the project area is being significantly elevated to the point that we'd expect to see some sort of change. Okay, so next slide. So what does this mean? Well, the summary is that the ferries generate very loud noise. Harbor porpoise can certainly hear this noise, and we expect harbor porpoise to respond to this sort of noise through avoidance. But there's no detectable change in presence, at least through this study, and the question then is why? Well, one answer is that the changes that are occurring are not detectable by the CPods, that there is a behavioral response, but it's not being manifested in terms of changes to echolocation activity. That's an important, if that is true, that's an important piece of information for how we would go about monitoring porpoise response to a tidal energy project. The second possible hypothesis is that there's some degree of noise habituation that has happened at this location where these harbor porpoise are somewhat more resistant or more resilient to loud levels of noise than, say, more wild locations. The third hypothesis is that when you have engineers trying to do biology, they can't come to a reasonable conclusion. But for the moment, let's reject the third hypothesis and think a little bit more about that noise habituation question. Next slide. So this is some work that Chris Bassett and I have been working on associated with the potential for habituation associated with vessel noise in the general project area. And this is a manuscript that's in production that hopefully should go into review shortly. And in this study, we looked at vessel traffic in the project area. This is now zoomed out. That little kind of dip in the land you can see in the upper right-hand corner is Admiralty Head. And the plots you're seeing there are vessel traffic density in the general project area by vessel class: tugs, cargoes, tanker vessels, and passenger vessels. And the takeaway here is that noise associated with vessel traffic, vessels are present in the area quite often, and the noise associated with vessel traffic actually drives the ambient noise budget. So that image on the right there, the black line is the measured probability distribution of noise in the project area, and the gray shaded outline is a reconstruction of that noise based solely on vessel class and vessel position relative to a receiver. So we can say that it's actually quite loud at this site, and the reason it's quite loud is because of vessel traffic. So perhaps that indicates that the reason that we're not seeing a detectable change in porpoise behavior, even though they're being exposed to relatively loud levels of noise, is because they are constantly exposed to relatively loud levels of noise. So, next slide. So if we think about this in terms of looking at the post-installation monitoring implication, if we were to undertake a study where we deploy a CPOD on the turbine foundation, what we're seeing now, again, is I'm repeating those two maps of received levels in broadband terms on the left and right for the 75th operating percentile and 99th operating percentile. At the 75th operating percentile, the detection range of the CPOD is shown as that red dashed circle. The received levels of noise within that circle are very much below 140 decibels. So if we're not able to really see a change in porpoise activity associated with that sort of noise level for the ferry, it may be very difficult to detect that sort of change in echolocation activity associated with a much quieter source. And even at the 99th percentile, where the received levels inside of the CPOD detection zone are similar to the sort of received levels we'd see from the passenger ferry, we're not detecting a change associated with those sort of levels from the passenger ferry. And so I think this definitely drives home kind of, for me, a lesson learned about, as we're thinking about how to structure these studies, it's really important to keep in mind not just the fact that marine mammals can be responsive to noise, but the sort of environmental context of the noise they're already exposed to, and they are powered to detect changes with the instrumentation that we might have available to us. So certainly I think that it's worth still using passive acoustics to monitor pilot scale projects to gain insight, but we should have some expectation about what sort of level of change we're likely to be able to detect. And final slide. This is just now a plea for questions, as well as acknowledging the other people who have been involved in this study, Joe Talbert, Jim Thompson, and Alex DeClerc for helping to design and maintain the sea spiders, the Washington State Parks for actually hosting our AIS receiver and the associated data logger, and the Department of Energy and Snohomish County PUD, which has helped to fund this study through a General Acoustic Effects Award that has been going on from 2009 to 2010. So thank you for your attention, and happy to take questions or comments on the study we've done.
Great. Thanks, Brian. I got about 5 minutes for questions, and a few have come in, so I'll go through them in order. First one, how does the turbine spectrum level compare with the monitored background levels in Admiralty Inlet? And isn't the spectral difference between the turbine noise and the background the key here?
Well, yes, but the background noise is largely driven by shipping, and the spectral shape of shipping noise is actually quite similar to the turbine noise in that the noise associated with shipping is generally concentrated at low frequencies, rolling off at high frequencies. Measurements of turbine noise to date indicate a very similar spectral pattern. So I think that this is not like say running a painter in the project area where you have very high intensity noise in, say, the 10 to 20 kilohertz range. This is actually, the turbine noise would actually be somewhat similar in terms of spectral content to the existing ambient noise.
Great. Next question. There are a couple questions sort of along these lines. How confident are you that your CPOD detector is really responding to harbor porpoise clicks and not to other environmental noise sources?
So the way the CPOD works is it detects clicks from all environmental noise sources. This could include other marine mammals, boat sonars, sediment movement, and then takes the properties of the click trains, looking at things like inter-click interval, the click frequency, click duration, and compares those to known click properties for a particular class of species. And that's how it actually makes, not just detects clicks, but actually identifies them as clicks associated with harbor porpoise. So we've gone through and done a manual review of some of the data, and certainly the clicks that the CPOD is classifying as harbor porpoise clicks certainly do have the properties that one would expect for a harbor porpoise click.
Excellent. Next question. I feel like I'm quizzing you, Brian.
That's
what
fine.
about I feel like I'm quizzing you here.
So that's fine.
So this one, what about the possibility that loud levels of noise just don't really bother porpoises to the point of altering their behavior, regardless of whether or not they have gotten used to the levels?
So, I think it's a question really of site and specific individuals, because there have been studies that do show harbor porpoise avoidance to loud levels of noise. I think it's more a question of the specific population and their experience and exposure to loud noises. So the problem with marine mammal behavior in general is there's not a single answer of how marine mammals respond to a given noise at a given place and time.
Great. A couple more. Did you see any relationship between the direction of the current and the behavior of the porpoises?
We saw, so the GLM indicated that there was not necessarily the direction of the current, but there was a somewhat negative trend in harbor porpoise presence with increasing current velocity, but it's not as if harbor porpoise are abandoning the area during periods of high current. So there is some correlation there, but it's not an overall key driver to their presence at the site.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out which final question to ask you. I think this one kind of sums up a couple things. So presentation underlined the whole adapting habituation issue. Given this, is it safe to assume that noise impacts really need to be considered in the context of each individual site and the pre-existing background noise?
I think it can certainly provide some useful context. As far as whether every single site study requires, a detailed background noise study like the one we've undertaken here, I would think that as we learn more about the sources of ambient noise at sites, that we can make much more informed predictions from more limited data sets about really what sort of contextual information is required to design a post-installation study, and what post-installation studies are most appropriate for a particular site. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that was great. And you do have a couple more on the question board. If you want to take the time to answer those in writing, that'd be great, Brian.
Okay, will do. Thanks, Don.
So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Michelle Halverson from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. And we're moving with Michelle's research sort of out of the field, out of the conceptual into the lab. And she's going to talk about the association between underwater noise exposure and tissue damage assessment in fish. So Michelle, if you're there, I think Anna is loading up her presentation now.
I am here. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, hear you just fine, and I'll do the same. I'll give you about 15 minutes and a 5-minute warning, and then Q&A afterwards. So when you're ready, take it away.
All right, thank you. So basically, with that long title, I'm just going to talk to you about how noise affects fish. And yeah, let's go ahead to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about some of the anthropogenic noise sources, and you've heard quite a bit about all of these already. I went ahead and classified them into 2 different groups. We have an intermittent and or continuous sounds, and that would include things like tidal turbines, which is what I will be talking about today. Anna, if you could hit the space bar, please. And the second group is impulsive sounds, which include things like pile driving. Pile driving tends to be transient. They have a fast rise time, and they can be more injurious type of signals. And they may also be used for installation of tidal turbines and wind farms and whatnot. And the continuous sounds tend to be of a lower intensity than impulsive sounds, but they tend to be also longer duration. Next slide, please. So the component of sound, thank you, is what I'm going to talk about on this slide. So sound is energy that can do work, and thus it can cause damage and tissue damage. And a couple of characteristics of sound are the range of frequencies that a source can generate, along with the intensity that a source can generate. And those make up the spectrum. And so 2 components that are in sound waves underwater are pressure, also in air, but are pressure and particle motion. And 2 aspects that are proportional to the distance of in the sound source and the frequencies being generated are the near field and the far field. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide, please. So there is concern about renewable energy development, and we've heard a lot of different concerns. And the one I'm going to talk to you about today are concerns about how these noises can impact fish. And a way to gauge these impacts on fish is to investigate the auditory system sensitivity and to investigate barotrauma, which is also tissue damage. Next slide, please. So by looking at the impacts on fish from sound, and I said we'll investigate the auditory system, this means that fish can hear. So we've heard about marine mammals. Well, fish are also out there, and they are hanging out in these areas. So up in the top left, I have an illustration of kind of the inside of a fish head, just a bit. And this is highlighted in yellow is showing the internal ear of a fish. So there are no external structures. And the metrics that are used to measure auditory changes are, one, to look at the sensory cell damage that's inside the ear, which are called hair cells. See if there's damage there. And the second way that's pretty common is to check the auditory sensitivity changes by comparing hearing sensitivity of control fish with hearing sensitivity of exposed fish. And I'll go into this more later. So this brings us into the graph on the right-hand side. There's a lot going on. We'll just break it down into a few pieces. So on the x-axis, we have frequency in hertz, and the y-axis, we have the sound pressure level in dB Ray 1 micropascal. So these are all for underwater sound levels. And I'll start with the fish, and those are the 3, the orange, red, and blue colored lines with the markers throughout them. And these are 3 fish of concern, and these are their audiogram curves. And the 2 things that you can get out of this are the level or the sensitivity level of each of those curves, and then also the frequency range for each of these fish. And there's other fish hearing, and this can get more complicated, but I'll keep it simple. But one of the things I want to point out is the fish can hear below 100 hertz. And there's some indication that many fish can hear down in infrasound, if not all fish. Now the 2 solid lines, the black and the purple, these are sound sources. And the black one is from impulsive pile driving sound on a project that I've been working on for several years. And the purple is from tidal turbines from the open hydro, and it's the exact same signals that Brian Pelagi was just talking about. And so again, the 2 things to take away from these sound source measures are that the frequency range that they cover, and that they cover the entire hearing range, frequency range for hearing in fish. And then the second thing to note is the level compared to hearing sensitivity of these 3 species that I've used for an example. Using an auditory evoked potential, and this is a hearing test, and I looked for changes in threshold sensitivity. So if I could have the next slide, please. And I forgot to mention that the fish that we used were juvenile Chinook salmon, because they're a listed species and of high importance. So the picture on the left is the entire auditory evoked potential kind of setup. And the picture on the right is actually looking inside the test chamber at a fish. And so the salmon were given a neuromuscular block. They were provided some respiration. There's electrodes that are placed just under the skin. One is over the brainstem, and the other is a reference electrode. And you can see the little blue circle down at the bottom that's an underwater speaker, and they present the pure tone to the fish. And neurologically, there's a synchronized brain response that washes over the brain to the tone, the stimulus tone that's presented. And what that looks like is on the next slide, please. And here you can see there's peaks and valleys, and this is the neurological response. And you can see at the top they're large amplitude, and they get smaller and smaller until they disappear into the background noise. And this is how we determine thresholds for each frequency that we tested. And the next slide shows you the data from that. And so this is an audiogram. This is just what you looked at earlier, one of our first figures. So on the x-axis we have frequency in hertz, and on the y-axis we have the sound pressure level. And these are a control and an exposed group of animals. The control are in red, the red line, and the exposed group or treatment group is in blue. Whoops. Page up. And one more. Thank you. And statistically, there were no differences between the control and exposed group for the hearing assessment. Okay, now we can go to the next slide, please.
And Michelle, a little bit more than 5 minutes left, just a 5-minute warning. And audience, it's a good time to start asking questions.
Perfect. Okay, and then so here we have the barotrauma, the orange group. And what happened is here is after 24 hours of noise exposure, the fish were given a detailed external exam, and then they were necropsied and given a detailed internal exam. And let's go ahead to the next slide. So when I say fish were given an exam, what does that really mean? So we used a list of about 72 different injuries that we looked for internally and externally. And then we needed to understand what the biological effects of those injuries were. So if there was a bruise on a fin or hemorrhaging of a vital organ, is there a difference between those? And we generated what's called the Fish Index of Trauma model, and we applied that, and I'll talk to you about that on the next slide. And basically it helped us get to the answer of what do these injuries mean to the fish. So let's start at the bottom of the slide. As I said, we had a long list of injuries that we looked at, and we took those injuries and we ranked them by their physiological importance. And such as a hemorrhaging heart was much more important than a hematoma, which is a bruise on a fin. And from that naturally fell out 3 injury classes, as we called them. And we gave them a name of mortal injury, moderate injury, and mild injury, and that's the red, orange, and green boxes. And this is just an abbreviated list here, what I'm showing you, but it's to give you an idea of what we did. And each of those groups was given a mathematical weighting. So when I would look at a fish, we would have a severity score. So if a fish, say, had a hematoma on its fin, was it just a little tiny hematoma, or was it one that kind of took over the whole fin? And so there was this, that was given a severity score. And then the weighting was multiplied by that severity score. And then those injuries, that was done for each injury that was observed in a fish, they were summed across all, that product was summed across all injuries. And that gave us a response severity weighted index. And this has proven to be a very sensitive test that we have so far. So if you could go ahead and bring us to the next picture, you're going to hopefully haven't eaten lunch yet or are well done with it. These are some examples of barotrauma injuries that were observed from the 24 hours of tidal turbine noise exposure. Down on the bottom is a control fish, and so that's to show you, kind of give you your basics of anatomy. We have heart, liver. Right above the liver is part of the digestive system. This is pyloric ceca. It kind of looks like little fingers. The white stuff below that is fat. Swim bladder covers the whole length, basically from under the heart to the vent on the back side of the fish, and then you can see the lower part of the intestine. So top left, the probe is pointing to the liver, and it's actually pointing to a hemorrhaging liver, and which is one of the more severe injuries that we're seeing. Then next to that we have the second picture. We have a pyloric ceca, those little fingers. Those are actually hemorrhaging. And let's go ahead to the last, or to the next slide. We're almost done here. So that just kind of gave you an example of some of the range of injuries that we have seen and do use in this model and investigate for. So this is a graph that shows all of the data from barotrauma. It gives the response severity weighted index on the y-axis for each individual fish. That's what each circle is. And on the x-axis, this is all of the data. The group on the left that have the C's, those are controls. The first 4 are controlled baseline, which means they came out of a tank, they weren't handled, and then they were just necropsied and investigated for barotrauma. The control group was actually placed into the noise exposure tank, except not exposed to any noise, to see if there was a handling effect. There was no statistical difference between control baseline and control. And then I have 4 exposure or treatment groups. And I guess the biggest thing to point out is that group 1 and group 2, you can kind of see that these injuries start off high and kind of fall off. These are all pretty low level injuries, and this is a very sensitive test that was able to pick up the low injuries And the first couple treatments, they did have some statistical, the first one had a lot and the second one had less, but statistical significance compared to the control groups. And the last two, treatment 4 and 5, did not have statistical significance. I have some potential theories we can talk about later. And then let's go ahead to my summary slide. And what we did find out was our initial findings with the auditory assessment is that there was not any damage to the auditory system or to auditory sensitivity. Again, these are initial findings, and all of this is still under investigation. And the barotrauma results indicate an onset of some minor injury at the test exposure that was used for these salmonids. And let's move on to the next slide. So the next phase of this study that I'm working on, you can call that phase 1, this will be phase 2, is to bring in a different species. So I'd use a salmon, Chinook salmon, and that's a physostomus fish. And a physostomus fish have a swim bladder that has a connection to the gut, which means that they need to gulp air in order to fill their swim bladder, but they can also expel air out of their swim bladder for whatever reason. But to become neutrally buoyant, which as I mentioned before is an important factor for these animals, particularly if we're handling them and using them for an experiment, they need to be able to fill their swim bladder, and they need some air bubbles to do that. The other group of fish is the Physoclistus, and so this will be the second phase of the study that I do, will be to expose a Physoclistus, which would be like a bass. And these fish have a closed swim bladder, and the way they can modulate or regulate the gas in their swim bladder is by what's called a Reet organ, and it's a capillary bed that can release the oxygen and basically remove it as needed. And for acclimation to become neutrally buoyant, they need a lot of time, and that can be hours to days because it's a small capillary system. And the belief behind the Physoclistus fish is that because they don't have the ability to release the pressure out of their swim bladder when they're, say, being impinged upon by a sound that might be putting too much pressure on their swim bladder, that these fish may be more susceptible to injuries and more sensitive. And that has been shown in some of the rapid decompression studies by my colleague Tom Carlson. And that is all I have for today. We can go ahead to the last slide. This just gives our contact information. And I want to say thank you to everybody, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Great, thanks, Michelle. That was excellent. We have a little less than 5 minutes for questions, and there's some questions that came in that are pretty darn technical, which I might ask you to answer in writing.
Okay. I'm
going to go through some of the more discussion-oriented ones that I see here. And the first one is, you mentioned this is sort of a worst-case scenario you're exposing fish to. Mm-hmm. And the question is, I'll just read it. Will you please summarize actual and observed damage to actual fish from exposure to actual tidal turbines? So that your discussion seems to have been focused extensively on laboratory testing methodologies for hypothetical situations and studies. So the question is really, how does the situation that you studied sort of compare to what you might actually see a fish do in the wild?
In real life. That's a complicated question. So initially, the first thing I want to say is the behavior of these animals around a fish, whatever species it is not well documented. It's not going to be documented at all yet. So salmon most likely would just keep on swimming by. So the 24-hour exposure would be an animal, a fish that would choose to stay or make a home on, say, an open hydroturbine. And the next species that in my second phase, the Physoclistus, a bass or perch, they do tend to reef on, and there's a good chance that they might decide to make that a home. When there's artificial reefs there, they kind of take up residence. And then a 24-hour exposure may not be a worst-case scenario for that species. So bringing it into real life, it's, I guess, species dependent more than anything else. And then the other thing is, you know, as we've talked, as it's been mentioned already, is these turbines will be turned on and then they'll be turned off. So the chances of them actually running for 24 hours straight is going to be pretty minimal, just with the fact that the tide's changing and things like that.
Great. Second question is, regarding the barotrauma experiments, how far were the fish located from the sound source?
It was a small tank, so I had an exposure tank, and that was about 1 meter deep, and I think about 1 meter across. And so there was a speaker placed into the bottom of that tank, and the fish were allowed to swim in this tank freely, so they could be right next to it, but at a minimum they'd be 1 meter away, or I should say at maximum they could be up to 1 meter away. So the sound levels within the tank were pretty consistent at about 160 for an RMS level.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. I'm looking for one that, a question about the sample size. What was the sample size in the auditory tests, and could this have contributed to the lack of statistical significance between test and control fish? I'm thinking that's for the hearing loss test.
Right. I can't recall the sample sizes off the top of my head, but they were exactly the same as, well, I shouldn't say that. It's a possibility. There was a lot of variability in the audiograms, and they need more. I shouldn't say audiograms. Sorry, in the auditory test, and they need more analysis, which is why I say it's kind of the initial findings right now. So sample size could be a possibility, but there was a sufficient amount. There was at least 20, an N of 20 in each group.
Okay, and then I just wanted to end, there was a clarification on the first question I asked, which is around sort of laboratory studies versus monitored studies, looking at fish damage, and the asker wanted just to clarify that these are laboratory studies and that there are no actual documented damages to fish from actual turbines from sound sources anywhere worldwide. So just sort of another clarification on lab versus field studies, I guess.
Okay. Are they asking me if there are any, or are they stating that there are not any?
I think maybe a little bit of both. I'm not sure. I just wanted to put it out there.
From what I know, there I don't know of any that have been documented, but I also don't know of any that have captured fish that are in the vicinity of any turbines that are presently working to look for the barotrauma.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. We are going to move on to our final speaker of the day, and that is Chris Bassett, also from the University of Washington, who will be discussing underwater noise measurements of a 1/7 scale wave energy converter. So, Chris, I see your slide presentation's up. Are you with us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
You're a little echoey. Maybe if you can move closer to the phone, that'd be good.
All right, how is it now?
That sounds better.
All right, great. Well, thanks for the introduction. I'll get going here. As just mentioned, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and just present some data, sound measurements from a pilot device. So first, I'd like to thank Jim Thompson and Brian Pelagi here at the University of Washington, as well as Ken Reinfrank from Columbia Power Technologies. And with that, could I get the next slide and get going here? So as mentioned, I'm going to be discussing noise from a 1/7 scale prototype wave energy converter. This device itself is a Columbia Power Technologies C-Ray. It's a heave and surge point absorber. It consists of two 5 kilowatt permanent magnet generators It's got a mechanical yawing system and is held to the seabed using a 3-point mooring. This picture here is the actual device off the shore here in Seattle, where we actually did the testing last spring. So can I get the next slide, please? To give you some actual information about the site, in the left panel here we have Puget Sound in Washington State, and I've highlighted an area near Seattle. In the right panel is that actual zoomed-in box there where we see a red square, and that's the actual deployment location of this prototype device, just off of West Point in the Seattle area. The site itself is about 20 meters deep, and Puget Sound in that area is on the order of 7 kilometers wide. Our study was performed on March 30th, 2011, excuse me, as a rapid response to storm conditions. So the University of Washington is located nearby, and the site, or this study was actually done as part of the permitting requirements to ensure that the noise levels from the device were not sufficiently high to potentially injure or harm marine mammals. So when the storm conditions came up, we ran out for a few hours just to take some measurements of the operating device. Okay, I'll get the next slide, please. So we had a number of different instruments that were used to get our data. The first, and probably most important for us, is the SWIFT. This is the Surface Wave Instrument Float with Tracking. This is a drifter designed by Jim Thompson here, and its primary purpose is actually for measuring surface waves. However, in this case, we've augmented the device for use in the acoustic study. And this drifter itself has a GPS unit for tracking and post-processing data. It has an anemometer on top of the spar buoy. It has a Garmin Astro radio frequency transmitter for real-time tracking of the device. It has a high-definition GoPro video camera, so we can see if waves are actually breaking over the buoy itself, which would create some noise. It has a Q-star accelerometer, which samples at 5 hertz, and that allows us to actually obtain wave spectra using this device. And then finally, we have a loggerhead DSG for acoustic measurements. Could I get the next slide, please? So the loggerhead itself, throughout this experiment, or throughout these recordings, operated on a continuous sampling cycle for 60 seconds every other minute. The sampling rate was 80 kilohertz, and this device is essentially a pressure case with mostly space for battery storage. And then there's a small data acquisition system located in the pressure case as well, and it takes just a flash card and connects directly to the hydrophone. So it's a totally autonomous system, which allowed us to deploy it on the spar buoy. The effective sensitivity of the hydrophone, when you account for the internal amplifier, is minus 166 dB with respect to 1 volt per micropascal. And finally, the linear response of this system is approximately 20 hertz to 30 kilohertz. So that's the range over which we're actually looking at some of this data. Next slide, please. So now, excuse me, one more slide. Ancillary data set. This is data that was provided to us by Columbia Power Technology. So on the seabed, as part of the 3-point mooring, there was a Nortec acoustic wave and current meter that's used to look at currents throughout the water column, and also wave height that we can use to compare with our data. And we also were given generator performance, in particular shaft speed for the 2 generators, both fore and aft, as well as generator torque. Now, to be perfectly clear about the data I'm presenting here, we had a data telemetry issue the day of our study, so we couldn't actually get this data from Columbia Power Technologies for the exact period of the study. So by looking at our data and providing them with our results, Columbia Power was able to go back through and pull out the most comparable conditions in their data set to provide us with generator performance and wave and current data. So it's not the exact same data set, but it still allows us to make some comparisons with the noise. So I'll take the next slide, please. So to start with just the wave measurements from the Swift itself, I have 4 plots here. In the top left, we have the 10 meter per second, or excuse me, the wind speed extrapolated at 10 meters in meters per second. So what we start off with is stronger winds on the order of 10 meters per second, decreasing in the late morning and approximately constant throughout the early afternoon. In the middle plot on the left-hand side, we have the significant wave heights. And they started off on the order of about 0.7 meters and decreased to a little bit under 0.5 meters. In the bottom left-hand, we see the dominant wave period at the site, which was about 3 seconds throughout the day. On the left-hand side of the plot, we see the wave spectra. Now, the units on this is the wave power in kilowatts per meter per hertz. And the x-axis is the frequency, and earlier in the day, not surprisingly, when the waves are larger, we have more power in the waves, gradually decreasing throughout the day. But in these wave spectra, once again, we see this important peak at about 3 seconds. So given that all of our wave data suggests, or what this wave data suggests, rather, is that we may see some periodicity associated with this 3-second period in our the noise from the wave energy converter. And finally, one other note: if this were a full-scale device rather than a 1/7 scale device, the significant wave heights would be on the order of 3 to 5 meters, and the dominant wave periods would be about 8 seconds. All right, I'll take the next slide, please. Okay, so this slide here contains 4 different plots of the generator torque and the shaft speed. I have normalized the data in all of these cases at the request of Columbia Power Technologies. Beginning in the upper left-hand corner, we see the y-axis, is the normalized generator torque versus 10 seconds. This data set, or this individual time series, is actually 5 minutes long, but I zoomed in on just 10 seconds so you can see that there is some periodicity, of course, in the generator torque. If you take a look at the upper right-hand plot, we have the spectrum of the generator torque versus the frequency. And once again, we see another peak in the torque spectrum for the aft generator at about 3 seconds. We have 2 individual peaks in the fore generator that are at slightly higher frequencies than for the aft generator. In the lower left-hand, or the lower left-hand corner, we have the shaft speed plot, and again we see a lot of periodicity, and the spectra in the lower right-hand corner come out with the same type of data as our generator torque, with that dominant peak at about 3 seconds, where most of the energy is contained. So once again, we expect that as we go forward to look at the acoustics, we're going to see some periodicity that in some way matches the spectra I've presented here. Next slide, please. So to move on to the acoustics data finally, here I've plotted a spectrogram on the top. The y-axis is the frequency going from 10 hertz to 20 kilohertz. And on the x-axis, we have 60 seconds. So this is one continuous sample. In the bottom plot, we have the total sound pressure level integrated from 60 hertz to 20 kilohertz for that 60-second period. And rather than integrating over the entire period, we've chosen to integrate above 60 hertz because after manual review of most of the data, we could find no evidence of significant noise from the device below 60 hertz. So looking back at the spectrogram up top, what we see is above about 100 hertz going up to around 1,000 hertz, a number of harmonics that modulate frequency with time. If you take a closer look at those frequency modulations, they occur on approximately the dominant wave period. In addition to those present harmonics, we see a number of what I call, I suppose, broadband slaps occurring at and above around 1,000 hertz that occur about twice per wave period. So to present this data in perhaps a more useful form, can I get the next slide, please? I've plotted that, there's the same spectrogram from before, but plotted on a linear scale, going from 0 to 1,000 hertz, and I've thresholded the data to highlight these different harmonics. So again, what's very clear is the series of 10 identifiable harmonics, and anyone who's familiar with, say, southern resident killer whale vocalizations would see patterns that look like examples of some of their calls almost. And then in addition, above 800 hertz, as I mentioned before, we see these broadband slaps. So before I step to the next slide, I'd like to make note of the peak pressure spectral densities of some of these harmonics. They're typically less than about 100 dB, where some of those broadband slaps that we see are a bit higher than that. So we'll carry those numbers forward onto the next slide, please. So of course, to really think about what the noise from these devices actually means in the local environment, we need to consider other ambient noise sources in the area. Puget Sound, it turns out, is an extremely busy urban waterway. There's a significant amount of noise, particularly from shipping vessels and ferries, but also recreational vessels and fishing vessels. So here's one example where we were out taking data, and the hydrophone itself was about 500 meters from the device, and there was a tug passing about 1 kilometer west of the site, and suddenly we can't see any sign of the wave energy converter in our spectrogram. So if we take a look at kind of the pressure spectral densities associated with this tug at a 1 kilometer, we see that the noise from the tug here is on the order of 110 dB, which is significantly higher than the data presented in the previous spectrogram, which was actually data taken on the order of about 150 meters from the device, I believe. So this makes it abundantly clear that to really think about how important this noise is in the area, we're going to have to think about all of the vessel traffic coming through. So could I get the next slide, please? So here's one way of presenting these spectrograms in a different way. Here I've produced 60-second averages of 3 different spectra. We have plenty more to choose from, but these are very good examples of what we saw. So in red, we actually have that 60-second average spectrum of that tug that I just showed. And in this case, the black line was that first spectrogram I showed for the wave energy device, and then there's another wave energy device average spectrum plotted in gray. The y-axis here is the pressure spectral density, and again, we have frequency on the x-axis. And one of the main points I'd like to make with this is that if we go back to the spectrograms, we saw a lot of frequency modulation in the noise, but when we average the spectra, what we see, rather than narrow harmonics from this device, we're seeing wide smeared out peaks beginning at about 100 hertz. And the point I'd like to make here is that perhaps with a tidal energy device, the noise might be approximately constant over the period of 1 minute, so average spectrum might be good ways of presenting the data. However, due to the periodicity of some of these wave energy devices, it makes a lot of sense to both present average data like these individual spectra, but it's necessary to provide more detailed time frequency data to really say anything about what type of noise these devices are creating. Can I get the next slide, please?
And Chris, you're at about a 5-minute warning now, and
great.
Good time to ask questions to the audience too.
Sounds great. Okay, so I'm sorry this figure is kind of blurry. It's great on my computer. So here, in the plot on the right, I've included all of the data we obtained with this Swift. The y-axis is degrees north, x-axis is degrees west, and we can see West Point located off in the upper right corner of the plot. And I guess the point I really want to make here, I don't want anyone to look too carefully at this plot, because it's hard as you try to find a pattern, you're not going to find one. And of course, we expect that noise from this device is going to decrease as we move away from it. The problem with doing this kind of study in Puget Sound is that there is so much vessel noise that if you throw a hydrophone out in the water for an hour, you're likely going to get a bunch of different vessels that pass. So it's actually very hard to get clean measurement of the operating device with no other ambient noise sources in the area. So therefore, this presentation of what the sound level or received levels from the device should be as we move away from it are not very clean. And as previously mentioned, this is due to significant amounts of vessel traffic in the area. Now, I'm not sure about the long-term statistics at this site, but I've been doing work in Admiralty Inlet with Brian, where we find mean broadband sound pressure levels from 20 hertz to 30 kilohertz to be on the order of 119 dB over the course of a year. So these are extremely loud sites. So we might expect that noise from these devices would often be masked. Okay, can I get the next slide, please? So really just to drive this point home, we made a plot of that broadband sound pressure level versus the distance from the device. And what's immediately clear is there isn't much of a pattern. So we can't comfortably say something about what the source level of this device is. We can just simply say that the ambient noise is significant enough to regularly mask noise levels from this device. And I'd like to point out that the maximum sound pressure level that we attributed to this device was 131 dB, and that was associated with the recording within 50 meters of the device. Other than that, most of the recordings were between about 125 and 116 dB. So clearly, this is a loud site, and it makes it difficult to say anything about this device. So I guess I'll step ahead to the conclusion slide here and get ready to take any questions from you. So just to reiterate some of what I think are the really important points here, that first, average spectra provide insufficient detail about the noise that this device itself creates, and I suspect a number of other wave energy devices create due to the inherent periodicity of waves. In addition to that, the noise from these devices in some ways is neither continuous nor impulsive. So I'm not sure from a regulatory standpoint how to think about the noise from these devices. Next, the loudest sound pressure levels that we recorded throughout the study were all attributed to vessels, and in all of those cases, those vessels were well a kilometer or more away from the hydrophone. So that says something about ambient noise levels in the area. And then finally, just given the proximity of this study site to busy shipping lanes and ferry traffic, it's really unlikely that this project is going to have any significant impact on ambient noise levels over anything greater than a couple hundred meters. So with that said, I would like to go to my final slide and just thank Columbia Power Technologies for allowing us to make this data available. We thought that it was very important simply to start providing some plots and some data for people to look at when they're thinking about the impact that these sounds might have on marine mammals and fish species. And thanks to the Department of Energy for their funding as well. And I'll take any questions now.
Great. Thank you, Chris. We have basically 3 questions, and they're all kind of on the same topic. So I'll ask it, and you can answer it. And that is really related to scaling. You mentioned this is a 7th scale device.
Yes.
And the question is, do you expect the sound to scale up with the device scaling up as well?
I would certainly, I can't comment, I'm not an expert on this, but I would expect that as the generators themselves are scaled up, that they will produce more noise. Of course, one of the big questions with that would be, as these devices are scaled up, are the generators scaled up directly? So can you take the power output from one generator and say, now we're going to use this exact same generator or same design, scale it up, and try to make that argument? I'm not sure if that can be done, because I'm not sure. I know that Columbia Power Technologies, for example, is looking to change, or is going to change, the generator as they scale up this device. But I can't really comment on how the noise from these devices would scale up directly. So I apologize for not being able to address that directly. If anyone has a good idea of how to do so, I'd love to hear.
Great. Well, I'm not actually seeing any other questions coming in at this point other than that one. So you must have hit the mark on your presentation, Chris.
Okay. Let me make one more comment, which I forgot to mention. Here I just briefly tried to touch on some of the data on our methods really quickly. But on the Northwest National Marine Renewable Energy website, specifically the one for the University of Washington, we have a short copy, or short paper that I wrote about this that has more details than what I was able to present today in a short time frame. So if anyone is interested in more information, it's publicly available there. So, and that's all.
Great, and that link was on your first slide, correct?
I don't think I had it on my first slide. Just 1 second here. Let me check.
Well, for those listening, if you Google, Northwest National Marine Renewable Energy Center, you'll find that link.
Yeah, sorry for failing to provide that link. Yeah, just NEMREC, as we call it, UW, and you'll get our website, and we have all sorts of information about this project and some of the stuff Brian presented earlier as well. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you to all our presenters. I'm going to turn it back over to Anna to have some final thoughts, but I would also like to thank, I think we had a great range of talks today that went from looking at sort of theoretical modeling considerations to field research to actual lab research. So I think we got a good breadth of talks on this topic, and I appreciate the chance to be with you all today. So Anna, please take us home.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks again to our presenters and to the audience for tuning in today. I think the talks were great, and I think the discussions and the questions were really nice to talk about here. I just want to mention that the work that's presented here is by no means a comprehensive list of all of the great acoustics work that's now going on. There is a lot of other acoustics monitoring work going on, whether it pertains to MHK or not. I think it still has an important role in MHK, and I think that there's a lot that we can learn from other efforts going on. And so this slide that I've prepared has a couple other projects that we know of that are going on. And I just want to open this up now, or not now, but if you do have any suggestions on projects to add to this, to please contact me via email. My email address is there on the screen. Please feel free to contact me with any suggestions of projects to add to this list. And also, some of you may be aware of our Annex 4 International Data Sharing Agreement that we are currently trying to gather metadata for this project. And this is dealing with any, not just acoustics data, but any environmental data related to marine and hydrokinetic or offshore wind development. If you do know of any, you could follow this link, which is to the Annex 4 metadata form, which is housed on the Pacific Northwest National Lab's TEFIS website. That's the site you probably recognize from where our past webinars have been posted. It's also a link that's on the webinar flyer that you may have received. And I will be sending out to this group the link to PNNL's TEFIS site where we are housing the webinar series. And I'll also include in that email a link directly to the Annex 4 form. And I also just want to mention that we do have another webinar, another 1 or 2 webinars coming up in this series The next webinar, we're planning on having a discussion on coastal and marine spatial planning efforts and how those relate specifically to marine and hydrokinetics. And this will most likely take place in mid-January in the new year, in 2012. So I hope some of you will be able to, or all of you will be able to make that one. And we will be sending out a notification of that date once it's finalized. And the audience members that attended this webinar will receive that notification. And finally, if you do have any questions, comments, or feedback to give to us on this webinar or the series in general, please let me know. Here's my email address again, and don't hesitate to contact me with anything. So with that, I'd just like to say thanks again for tuning in, and I hope you can join us for the next webinar in our series.